In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create this mini Christmas tree using geometry nodes. So as I record this, Christmas of 2023 is almost here, and every year for Christmas, I love making Christmas themed tutorials. And if you have any Christmas tutorial requests, then definitely let me know in the comments. And you can also check out my Christmas tutorial playlist to watch more of my past Christmas themed tutorials. So in this tutorial, we'll be using geometry nodes to create this mini Christmas tree. So we're going to start off by modeling the tree trunk, and then we'll create a procedural material for the bark, and then we'll be creating some small needles and some small branches. Then we'll be using geometry nodes to put the needles on the small branches, and then we'll be creating another geometry node setup to put the small branches on the tree. Now for the Christmas lights on the tree, I am going to be using my customizable Christmas lights created with geometry nodes, and that is a product which I created last year. So with my geometry node Christmas lights, you can just add the Christmas light geometry node setup to a curve object, and then you can go into edit mode of the curves, and you can move the curve handles around, and then the Christmas lights will follow the curve. And so you can very easily set up Christmas lights in your scene. And the Christmas lights geometry node setup also has some different customizable values, like the size of the lights and the amount of lights, and also the wire thickness and the wire twist, and some other customizable settings. And the Christmas lights material also has some different color presets, so you can choose between different color presets. You can choose a colorful one, which is all the different colors. You can choose like a candy cane one, which is just red and white materials, and there's like blue and purple materials and yellow materials and different Christmas light colors. So if you'd like to purchase the Christmas lights geometry node setup, you can find it with the link in the description. And I'll just be adding in the product files into the scene at the end of the video, and I'll be adding it to the Christmas tree. Or you can watch the tutorial that I made on how to create the customizable Christmas lights, so you can find all the links to that in the description. Alright, so I'm in a new scene in Blender, and let's get started. So I'll select everything with the A key, and I'll just hit X, and let's delete. So I now want to make the tree trunk, so I'll press Shift A. Let's go here to Mesh, and I'm going to add a cylinder. And then right after I add the cylinder, right behind me, there should be a little add cylinder setting here. You can just click on the arrow there to turn it on and open it up right after you add the cylinder. And here on the vertices, I'm going to turn this to 12 so that there is less geometry, and then I can close these settings. So I now want to scale this down because it is too big. So I will scale it down, and I'll type in 0.4 and enter so it is a bit smaller. And then I'll press Ctrl A and I'll apply the scale. So this is the object's new default size. So I'll now hit the tab key to go into edit mode, and you can see the origin point is right down there, and so I do want the origin to be at the bottom of the tree trunk. So I'll hit G to grab and bring it up on the Z axis, and I'll just bring it up right there so that the origin point is about at the bottom there. Then I want to scale it down so it's quite a bit smaller, so I'll hit S to scale, but then I will hit Shift Z after I scale it. So by pressing Shift Z, it'll exclude the Z axis, so I can scale it down on the X and Y but not the Z. I'll place it there, zoom in a bit, and then again I'll hit S to scale, I'll hit Shift Z, and I'll make that even smaller. Then I'll press Ctrl R to add a loop cut, and I'll left click to add a loop cut there and drag it up and then place it about there. And then I want to scale the loop cut down so that as the tree trunk comes up, it'll get a little bit smaller. So I'll scale that down a bit more. Then I'll hold down the Z button and go into wireframe, and I'll deselect everything and then just click and drag to box select these top ones here. And I'll scale these down even smaller and move them down a bit. And I might box select everything here and just scale that up a bit. And then I could go down here and deselect everything and just box select the bottom part and scale that up a little bit. So you can see it's kind of pointy and it gets smaller and smaller as it goes up. Alright, so I'll go back into object mode with the tab key, and then using the object context menu, I'll just shade the object smooth. Now you can see there's some weird shading here, and that's because we shaded it smooth. So what I'll do is go back into edit mode, and I'll just press Ctrl R to add a loop cut, and I'll drag a loop here and then just place it down there kind of towards the end. Go back to object mode, and that shading does look a bit better. Alright, so we're now going to be creating the branch object. So I will press Shift A, let's go to Mesh, and I'm going to add a cube, and the cube is really big, so I'll hit S to scale, and I'm going to type in 0.2 and then enter so it is quite a bit smaller, and then I can press Ctrl A and apply the scale, so that's the object's new default size. So I will now go into edit mode with the tab key, and in edit mode I'll hit S to scale, but then I want to hit Shift Y. So Shift Y will exclude the Y axis, and I can make it very small. I need to do that again, so S to scale, Shift Y, and make it really thin because this is just going to be the small branch. And then I'll deselect everything and just box select these front vertices here, and I'll scale that down so it's quite a bit smaller so that the back is bigger, and then as it goes forward it gets smaller. So then I can go back into object mode, and using the object context menu I'll just shade that object smooth as well. Now I do want to go back into edit mode, and I want to select the entire mesh, and I want to hit G to grab and bring it over on the y-axis, and I want to stick it right here. If I go back into object mode, in object mode I'm going to move it over on the x-axis so that I can see it better. So now I can go back into edit mode, and I want to move it over on the y-axis so that the origin point is at the very end there, because when we add the geometry nodes, the branches are going to come out from where the origin point is. So I'll go back into object mode, and you can see the origin point is at the very end there. And then if I go back into edit mode, I think I also want to scale the entire thing up a bit. So I'll scale it up so it's a little bit bigger, and then I'll bring it forward on the y-axis and place it there. So that's a little bit better. All right, so we can now model the needle object. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go here to mesh and add a plane, and I can bring the plane over so it's out of the way of the other objects. And then I'm going to scale this down because it's way too big, and I'm going to type in 0.08 and then hit enter. So I've scaled it down by 0.08. And then just like the other objects, I'll press Ctrl A and I'll apply the scale. So I'll now hit the tab key to go into edit mode, and I'm going to scale it down on the x-axis and make it quite thin because this is just going to be one needle, so it'll be very small. And then I'll select these two vertices here and I'll scale that down so it's even thinner. So again, it's thicker here and then it goes thinner as it gets smaller. And let's also save this project. So if you haven't saved it already, you can click on File and Save As. And you can just save the Blender file in a folder on your computer. I'll just call it tree.blend, and I will just save the project. So then you can press Ctrl S to save the project as you're working on it. Now I also want the origin point to be at the end, just like these other objects. So I'll hit G to grab, and I'll bring it over on the y-axis so that the origin point is at the very end of the needle. So I can now go back to object mode, and I'll just save this again. So we're now going to be creating the materials. So we'll first do the material for the tree trunk. So I'll select the Christmas tree trunk. And let's go over here to the shading workspace. So I have the 3D viewport right over here. I'll hold down the Z button and go into the material preview so we can see the material. And also let's click right up here on this little arrow. And here on the world strength, I'm going to turn this up to like 2 so it's much brighter so we can see the material better. All right, so I'll click on new here to add a new material, and I can just call it trunk. All right, and then I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on in the video to preview the different nodes. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click on Edit, and you can go to the Preferences, and then over there in the Add-ons tab, just search for Node Wrangler, and you can enable the Node Wrangler add-on, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So for this material, I'm going to press Shift A, then I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture. We're basically just going to be creating a pretty simple procedural tree bark material. So we'll add this noise texture, and then to use the feature of the Node Wrangler, you can hold down the Control and Shift key and then select different nodes. And that is going to preview it on the object by Control, Shift, and selecting it. And also with the noise texture selected, I'll press Ctrl T, and that is going to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. Now you can see the noise looks like it's really stretched, and so I'm going to take the object and I'm going to put that into the vector of the mapping. So by using the object coordinates, it's going to place the texture on the object more evenly. And we can now change some of the settings of the noise texture. So I'm going to turn the scale up to like a 40 so you can see it much better. And you can see now, because we use the object coordinates, it's not really stretched. So we'll turn the scale up to 40. I also want to turn the detail to the max of 15, and the roughness here, I'll turn that to like a 0.6 so that it's a bit more rough. So I now want to take the factor and I want to plug that into the base color of the principled shader, and then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview that. Now I do want to change the colors, so I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and we'll put the color ramp here between the noise texture and the principled shader. And then we can make some different colors, and I also want to make it more contrasty. So what I'm going to do is drag the black tab out here so you can see that a bit better, and then also drag the white tab out a bit more. So something like that, so they're a bit more contrasty. And then here on the white color, I want to make this kind of a brown bark color. So here on the white color, I'm going to make this kind of an orangey color, and then I'm going to make it a bit darker. And if you want to use the same exact color that I'm using, then here on the brown color, you can click on the color and go to the hex value, and you can punch in a hex value of 996446. So that is going to be the color, but I also want to plug the noise texture into the normal to give it some bump. So I'll take the factor, let's put that into the normal. But when I do that, you can see there's some weird shading issues, and that is because I need to convert the black and white data into normal data that the shader can use. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the bump node, and we'll put the bump node in between the noise and the principled shader. And then we want the factor to be going into the height value, and that way it'll convert it to normal data. So you can see now the surface looks really bumpy. However, it is too strong, so I'm going to turn the strength down to like a 0.4 so it is less strong. And that is it for the tree bark material, so it is pretty simple. So I'm now going to be creating the material for these two objects here. So the needle object and this branch, they're both going to be the green needle material. So let's select the needle, and I can click on new to add a new material, and I can call it needle. And then also if I select the small branch, I'm going to click on the drop down, and I'm going to add the same needle material. So for this material, I'm going to press Shift A, and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture because I do want to add a little bit of noise just to add a bit of variation. So I'll drop the noise texture here, and I can also press Ctrl T with the noise texture selected, and that's going to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And then I want to plug the object into the vector so that it places the texture on the object more evenly. And then I can Ctrl Shift and select the noise texture to preview it on the object. So I want to make the noise texture very small, so I'll turn the scale to 1, but then the detail here, I'm going to turn this all the way up to the max of 15. And then I'll leave the other settings how they are. So I can now take the factor, and I want to put this into the normal, but then just like I did before, I want to press Shift A and go to the search, and I'll search for a bump node, and let's stick that after the noise texture, so just plug it in there, and then the factor can be going into the height value of the bump. So I can Control Shift and select the principled shader, and now you can see it's giving a little bit of surface bump to the material. But I do want to make it very subtle. I just want to add a tiny little bit of bump variation, but I do want it to be hard to see. So I'm going to turn the strength to 0.1 so it's very hard to see. Now for the color, I want to add a green color. So let's click on the base color here, and I can make it bright green. But then I do want to make it a bit darker so it's not quite as bright. And if you want to use the same exact color that I'm using, you can go to the hex value and you can punch in 2E6616. And then to make this a bit more realistic, I want to add a bit of subsurface scattering, and the subsurface scattering is going to allow a little bit of light to go through the green needles, and that'll make it look a bit more realistic. So we'll open up the subsurface here, and this weight here, I just want to turn this to a 0.5 so there's a little bit of subsurface, and then I'll leave all the other settings how they are. Now I do want to see how these materials are going to look in the rendered view, so I do want to add some lighting. So let's go back here to the layout, and I'm going to go right over here to the world properties, and I'm going to be adding in an HDRI to get some nice realistic lighting, and I'll have a link in the description to the HDRI that I'm going to be using if you'd like to download it. So you can go here to color on the world, and you can click on the yellow dot here, and then you can choose environment texture, and then you can click on open to open up the HDRI. And this is the HDRI that I'm going to be using. So it is the Christmas Photo Studio 01. So this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com. Link will be in the description if you'd like to download it. And I downloaded the 1K version and also the HDR version on Polyhaven. So I'll just click on this and then click on open image. So I can now hold down the Z button and move my mouse up into the rendered view. And I am going for realism in this tutorial. I do want to get a realistic result, so I am using the Cycles rendering engine over here on the render properties, but you could also use Blender Eevee if you wanted to. So we can now see how those materials are going to look. Now, while we're doing the lighting, we might as well go over the color correction. So I'm going to go here to the render properties, and I'll go down here to the color management, and I'm going to be using this new view transform, which was added to Blender 4.0. So it is the AGX. You could also use Filmic if you want to. And then here on the look, I'm going to use the high contrast, so it kind of pops out the colors and makes things look more saturated and contrasty. Now, I do want this scene to be a bit brighter, so I do want to add another light. So I'll press Shift A, and I will go down here to light, and I'm going to add the sunlight. And I'll bring the sunlight up, and I'm going to also rotate it over a little bit and rotate it back so that it is pointing at the objects. And then if you go over here to the object data properties, I do want to make the sun a bit brighter. So I'm going to turn the sun strength to a 10, and then I'll just leave the color white, but if you wanted to, you could change that color. And then I also want to turn the angle up, because real quick, if I just press Shift A and go here and add a plane, so you can see the shadow of this object is very, very sharp, and that is because on the sunlight settings, the angle is very small. But if I turn the angle up so that the angle is much bigger, you can see the shadow is going to become very soft. So I'm going to turn the angle to 30, and that way the lighting and the shadows will be quite a bit more soft, and it'll make the final scene look nicer. So for now, I'll just select the plane and I'll just delete it, but we will be adding a plane later at the end of the video. Now I'll also add a camera, so I'll press Shift A, let's go down here to camera, and we can just add a camera, and then you can move your view to wherever you want the camera to be, and you can press Control Alt Numpad 0 to bring the camera to where we are. And I also want to press Control B in the camera view and just add a box around the camera, and that way it'll only render what the camera can see. And then I do want to make it a square image. So if I go here to the output properties, I'm going to make the resolution, the X resolution and the Y resolution the exact same number. So I'm going to use 2560 by 2560. You could also just use like 1920 by 1920, but I want a pretty large image. But I'm just going to make these the same number so that it is square. And then if you select the camera by clicking up here, you can hit G to grab, and you can just move the camera around, and I'll just place it here kind of in the center so it is pointing at the tree. And then also these two objects here, I'm going to select both of them, and I'm going to move them to the side so they are out of the camera view. Alright, so we can now add the geometry nodes. So I'll hold down the Z button and move my mouse back to solid view, and what I first want to do is use geometry nodes to place the needle on the small branch. So I'm going to select the small branch, and then I'm going to click right here to go to the Geometry Nodes workspace. And if you don't have the Geometry Nodes workspace, you can click on the plus here, and you can go to General and then add new Geometry Nodes. So I'll go over here to Geometry Nodes, and I'm going to press the period on the numpad to zoom in to the object. And then right here, let's click on New to add new Geometry Nodes to the object. So to add the needles onto the small branch, I'm going to press Shift A, and I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for the instance on points node, and let's stick this here. And then I also need to press Shift A and go to the search, and I need to search for the distribute points on faces node. So I'll drop this here. So these two nodes we're going to use to distribute the needle on the object. However, you can see the object has disappeared, and that's because we need to take the original geometry of the object and add it back up here at the end of the geometry nodes. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'll search for the join geometry, and we'll stick the join geometry at the very end here, and then we'll take the original geometry and we'll put that into the join geometry. And then I can bring these nodes down. So now we can see the branch again. So now to add the needle, I can press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the object info node. So just place the object info node down here, and then I want to choose the needle object. So I'll click on the eyedropper and I'm going to choose the needle object. So this object info is now using the needle as the object. So to instance this object or distribute it on the branch, we're going to take the geometry and we're going to put that into the instance on points. Now you can't really see anything happening. That's because we need to turn the density up. So if I turn this density way up, now you can see it's distributing the needles on the branch. So I want to have many needles. So here on the density, I'm going to turn this up to 10,000. So you can punch in 10 and then add 3 zeros at the end. So now there are many needles. Now the problem is that the needles are all pointed forward, so we need to use this rotation value to rotate the needles around. But if I just rotate these values, the Z and the Y and the X, it's just rotating them all together, but I instead want them to be randomly rotated in different directions. So to do that, I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the random value node, if I can actually spell it correctly, random value. So we'll drop this here, and so we can instead put the random value into the rotation, and that way each instance, so each needle will be randomly rotated. So let's just stick that in there. So I can now turn the maximum up, and I'm actually going to turn up to a really high value like 1,000. So the minimum is 0 and the maximum is 1,000, and those are the random values that it will generate. Now there is a problem with this, and that is that they're all over the place and it looks kind of messy, and I instead want all of them to be pointed kind of up here, but then going around in a circle, I want them to be random. So what we need to do is unplug this, and we need to break up these 3 values, and then we'll just plug the random value up to the one that we want. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the combine XYZ, and we'll stick this here, and we'll put the vector into the rotation. So now it's broken up these 3 values, so we can now just plug this up to the ones that we want. So I'm going to plug the random value node up to the Y. So this way it's going to randomly rotate them around on the Y axis. And then the Z one, I want to leave the Z at 0. I don't want to move this around. But then the X one here, we can turn the X up. And if I go over here to the side, if I turn the X up slowly, you can see it is opening up. And it's almost like a flower, kind of like the petals of a flower opening up. And so this way, all of the needles are pointed forwards. So I'm going to turn this to like a 0.76, so all the needles are pointed up this way, but then this random value is kind of randomly rotating them around the branch. So that is exactly what we want. Now I do want to turn the scale down a bit, so what I can do is press Shift A and go to the search, and I can search for a value node, and let's drop the value here, and then I can put the value into the scale. And why I'm doing this is because we have an X, Y, and Z value, but this just makes it kind of easier to just use one single scale value. So I'll put the value into the scale, and then I can just drag the value around, and that value is controlling the scale of the needles. And I'm going to turn this to like a 0.6. I think a 0.6 is a pretty good scale, but you could change this to your liking. Now I think I want to scale the branch up, so I'm going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to select everything, and I'm going to scale the branch up on the y-axis and also bring it forward a little bit so that they're a bit longer. So just make the branch a little bit longer. And then also if you wanted to add a bit more needles, you could. So right here on the density, I think I might turn this up a little bit. So let's double that. So we'll do 20,000. That is a bit better. All right, so that is the geometry node setup for the branch. So we're now going to be using more geometry nodes to put the branch on the tree. So let's select the tree, and I can actually just go into the camera view. Let's click on new here to add new geometry nodes, and I can actually call this like tree. And then actually if I click on the other geometry nodes, I can just rename this to like branch, just to keep it nicely organized. All right, so I'll select the branch again, and I will drag the group input out. So we want to add a similar setup. So we're first going to press Shift A, go to the search, and we're going to search for the instance on points. So we'll drop this in here, and then also press Shift A, go to the search, and we're going to search for the distribute points on faces, and we'll drop this here. So these are the two nodes we're going to use to distribute the branch on the tree. And you can see that the tree has disappeared. That's because we need to press Shift A and go to the search and search for a join geometry. So we'll drop the join geometry here. And we want to take the original object's geometry, which starts here, and we want to put that back up to the join geometry. So now you can see the object again. So again, just like we did before, I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search. And I'll search for an object info node, drop this here, and then we want to click on the eyedropper and we want to choose this branch here. So then to actually be able to see it on the mesh, we're going to put the geometry into the instance. Now I'm going to be adding many branches, but I want to avoid the branches going through each other. So to do this, we're going to take the distribute points on faces, and we're going to change this to the Poisson disk. So the Poisson disk is going to give us a distance min value, and so this will add distance in between each branch. So on the distance min, I'm going to turn this to a 0.01, just so that there will be a little bit of distance between each branch. And then I can turn the density max up, and I'll make it really big, and right now they're just pointed forward, but I'll just turn this up quite a bit for now. Now, just like we did before, I want to make them randomly rotate around. So we're going to use a similar setup. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'll search for the combine XYZ. We'll drop this here, and then we'll put the combine XYZ vector into the rotation. So it's breaking up all the values. And then I can press Shift A, we'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the random value, just like we did before, to give it random rotations. And this time I want to put the random value into the Z because we want it to rotate around on the Z axis. And then here on the maximum value, I'll turn that to 1000, so it's very random. So you can see they're all randomly rotated around. And then I also want to take the X value and I want to drag this down into the minimum. So we're going to drag it into the negative values. And this way you can see the tree branches are going to be pointed up. So I'm going to turn the X value to a negative 0.5 so that the branches are pointing up just a little bit. Now the branches are way too big, and so I want to make them smaller. But then what I also want to do is make each branch get smaller as it goes up so that there are smaller branches on the top and then bigger branches on the bottom, and that'll make it look like a classic Christmas tree. So what I'm going to do is plug a gradient texture into the scale so that the branches are small here, but then as the gradient changes color, they'll get bigger. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search. And I'm going to search for the gradient texture. Let's drop this here. And then I want to take the color and I'll put the color into the scale. Now it's not really doing anything right now. That's because we need to change some of the settings. So here on the gradient texture, I want to change the linear to spherical instead. And already you can see it's starting to work. So the branches up here are smaller, and then as they go down, they get bigger. However, there are a few things that I want to change, and I want to be able to have more control over it. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search. And I'm going to search for the position node, and let's drop the position node into the vector. And then in between this value, I want to press Shift A and go to the search. And I'm going to search for the map range node. So the map range node are going to make the values lighter or darker, and so that'll make the gradient lighter or darker, and that'll control the scale. So we'll put the map range here after the position, but before the gradient. So the position node can just go into the value, and now you can see if I drag around the from min and the from max in these values, we can change the size of those branches. So I'm going to start by turning the from minimum value down a bit so they're all a bit smaller. And I'll turn the first value, the from min, to a -5.4. So then the from max, I want to turn this up a bit so everything's a bit bigger here. And I will turn this value to a 1.3. Then the to min, I'm actually just going to leave this the same because it kind of just changes the overall scale. But this to max, I'm going to turn it up a tiny bit more. So I'll turn this value up to a 1.02. Now to have even more control over this, I want to add a color ramp here after the gradient to control the colors even better. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search. And I'll search for a color ramp, and we'll put the color ramp here after the gradient. So now I can drag these values around, and I can drag the black tab here and the white tab over here. So I'm going to drag the black tab to about here, and then I will drag the white tab over, and I'll drag the white tab over to about there. And then what I want to do is actually make the branches so that they disappear at the very bottom. So I'll hold down the control key and click here to add another black one, and I'll drag this other black one way over to the very end. So you can see by dragging this over, you can see we're basically removing all the branches from the trunk, because where it is white, the branches are going to be bigger, but then where it is black, there's going to be no branches. So you can just drag this around, put that there, then the white one, and it gets really big at this white point, and then it gets really small again, and so they disappear. So that is what I want. Now there's a problem with this, the bottom branches are way too big, but I can easily change that by clicking on this white tab right here, and I can click on the color, and I can make this more gray. So if it's more gray, they're all going to be a bit smaller. So just turning this to kind of a light gray color works well for my scene, and the hex value that I'm using for this gray color is C1, C1, C1. So now if I go back here to the distribute points on faces, I can turn up the density max, and I'm going to turn this way up so that there are way more branches. So I'm going to turn up my density max to 100,000. So you can type in 100 and then add 3 more zeros so that there are lots of branches. And if I hold down the Z button, move my mouse up into the rendered view, you can see this is really starting to look like a mini Christmas tree. Now I do want to add even more needles to the tree trunk, so what we're going to be doing is creating another geometry node setup which is very similar to this, which is just going to have needles. So what I'll do is deselect everything, and then I'll just click and drag to box select all of these nodes here in the center, but not the group input and not the group output. So with these nodes selected, I'm going to press Ctrl Shift D. So Ctrl Shift D is going to duplicate the nodes, but it'll keep the wires plugged up. So I can drag the group input right back here, and then this join geometry, I can just drag this down, and this group input, I can drag it over. So what you can do to organize this better is just box select all these nodes, and then you can press Ctrl J, and that'll join it together into a frame. And if you press F2 with the frame selected, you can rename this, and I'm just going to rename this to branches. And then I'll do the same thing over here, so I'll click and drag to box select these nodes, and I'll press Ctrl J to join it together into a frame. And if you select the frame and press F2, you can call this needles. So to make this not too laggy, I'm going to start by turning the density value way down to just like 100, so it's not quite as laggy. And then to be able to see the needles better, I'm going to go up here, and I'm actually going to unplug the join geometry from the group input, and I'm going to plug this join geometry from the needles into the group input. And then to be able to see the needles a bit better, I'm going to unplug the join geometry from the group output, and I'll take this bottom join geometry and plug that up instead, so you can see what it's doing. So now I need to change the object. So I'll go over here to the object info, and I will delete this from the object info. And then if I navigate over here, I want to click on the eyedropper, and I want to choose this plane here, which is the needles. So now you can see there are little needles on the tree trunk. So now I can turn the density max up, and I'm going to make it quite big. However, this distance min, I can just turn this to 0 because I don't really care about the distance min. So let's turn this up and add many more needles. So for the needles, I'm going to add 250,000. So you can type 250, and then after that you can add 3 more zeros. So you can see now there are a bunch of needles all over the tree trunk. And then if you want to change the scale of the needles, you can go right down here to the color ramp and you can click on this white color and you can drag this up and down to change the scale. So I think I might turn it down a little bit, but not too much. So there we go, there's all the needles, and that'll add a bit more detail. So I can now go right back up here and we have the branches and the needles, and I want to join them together so we can see both of them. So to do that, I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search here, and I'll search for another join geometry, and I'll drop it here in between both of them, and I'll plug this geometry up to the join geometry, and this one here up to the join geometry, so we're adding both of the geometry node setups together, and then the geometry can go into the group output. So now you can see that they're both added. So if I go into the rendered view, now you can see the tree looks much more dense in the center because there's all those needles. So that looks a lot nicer. Alright, so we're now going to be adding the star on the top of the tree. So I will hold down the Z button, go back to solid view, and let's also go back here to the layout so we have more space. So to create the star, I'm going to be using a built-in Blender add-on. So to enable the add-on, you can click here on Edit, and you can go to the Preferences. So in Blender's user preferences, we want to go here to add-ons, and we want to search for extra, and we want to add the add mesh extra objects. And then also later in this video, we're also going to be using the add curve extra objects. So just check mark both of those add-ons. So I'll now close the Blender user preferences. So I can now press Shift A, and if you go to mesh, you can see there's all these extra objects here. So I'm going to go to mesh, then go to extra, and then I'm going to add this simple star. So I'll add simple star, and then I'll hit tab to go into edit mode, and I want to select the top vertex, and then go down here and select the bottom vertex, so you can see both of those vertices are selected. So I now want to press Control I, and Control I is going to invert the selection, so now all of the outside is selected. And I can scale everything down on the Z-axis, just scale that all down, just like that, so that it is much smaller there. So it's really thick in the center and then gets smaller. So I'm now going to select everything with the A key, and I'm going to press Control B. So Control B is going to add a bevel, and I'm going to scroll my mouse wheel so that the bevel is a bit smooth, place it there, and then I can go back to Object Node, and using the Object Context menu, I'll shade it smooth. So I can now scale this object way down, and I'll bring it up on the Z-axis, scale it down much smaller, and then press the period on the numpad to zoom into it. And I want to rotate it, and I'll rotate it on the X-axis by 90 degrees. And then if I go to front view, I also want to rotate it over a bit more, just like that. Alright, so I'll hit the tab key to go into edit mode, and in edit mode, I'm going to press Shift A, and I want to add a little cup kind of at the bottom so that it can connect to the tree. So I'll add a cylinder, I can zoom out here, and I'll scale the cylinder way down and bring it up, and scale it down even smaller. So I can hold down the Z button, go to wireframe, and then I want to deselect everything. And then I will click and drag just to box select the top pieces here, and I will scale them down so that they're a lot smaller and bring it down on the Z-axis. Then I'll hit E to extrude and extrude those up, scale it down a bit more. So now what I can do is go here to the face select, and I'm going to select this face, and I'll hit the I key to inset that face so that it is smaller, and then I can extrude it up so it's much bigger. And let me zoom in here so you can see that better. So I'll scale that down a bit more. So let's go back to Object Node, and using the Object Context menu, I can shade this smooth. And you can see the shading looks a little bit weird here. That's because there's not very much geometry. So I'll go back into Edit Mode, and I'll press Control R to add a loop cut, and I can left click, drag down, and then left click right there. And then also I do want to add a bevel right here. So I'll click here to go to the vertex select. I'll hold down the Alt key and just select that loop of vertices. And then I'll press Control B to add a bevel. I'll drag it out and place it there. So I can zoom out, and I'll go back to Object Node, and we now have a nice little star. So let's now create the star material. So I'll go over here to the shading workspace, I'll go into the camera view, and I'll hold down the Z button and move my mouse up into the rendered view. Let's zoom into the star. I could even maybe make the star a little bit bigger. Let's click on new here to add a new material, and I can just rename it to star. So I want to turn the metallic value all the way up to 1 so that it is metal. And then here on the base color, I want to make this a bright yellow color. So something like that. And then I want to turn the roughness down, so I'll turn the roughness to like a 0.2, or maybe turn this up to like a 0.3. That is a bit better, so it's just a little bit more shiny. All right, so let's go back here to the layout, and I'm going to zoom out here, and I'm now going to create kind of a little base there for the bottom. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to Mesh, and I'm going to add another cylinder, and I will hit the Tab key to go into Edit Mode, and in Edit Mode, I'm going to scale the cylinder way down so it's much smaller, and I'll scale it down the Z-axis, kind of flatten it, and then I'll scale the whole thing up a little bit, something like that. And then if I go here to the face select, I can select this top face, and I'll scale the top face down, and then if I select the bottom face, I can scale that up a little bit. I can go back to object mode, and then I will press Control 2 in object mode. That is going to add a subdivision surface with 2 levels. And then I'll use the object context menu to shade the object smooth. Now it is very round, so I want to add some sharpness on the edges. So I'll go back into edit mode, and I'll press Control R to add a loop cut, and I'll drag this up here. Control R to add another cut, and let's drag this down here. And if I go back to object mode, you can see the edges are much rounder now. Now for the material for this little bottom piece, I'm going to be using my procedural fabric material. And so if you'd like to check out the tutorial and learn how to create that material, I'll have the link in the description. And you can also purchase the procedural fabric material with the link in the description. So to add the material, I'm actually going to be using my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack. So I'm going to click over here on the Assets tab, which I've created. And then here on my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack in the Asset Browser, I can search for fabric, and I can zoom in here, and I'm just going to drag the fabric material and drop it on here. So if you've purchased my Blender Procedural Material Pack, my Ultimate Procedural Material Pack, then you can just search for fabric here, and you can add the fabric material. So I'm going to go back over here to the shading workspace now, and then I'll zoom into the object here. And then I want to UV unwrap this, so I'll hit the Tab key to go into edit mode, and I'll press the A key to select everything, and then I'll hit U, and I will do Unwrap Smart UV Project, and then just click on OK. So now it has some UV mapping. So then if I zoom out here, here's the procedural fabric material, and in my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack, I have joined this together into a custom node group, and I've added these customizable values. So here on color 2, I want to make this a gray color. So I'm going to turn the red, green, and blue values all the way to 1, but then I will turn this down so that it is a very dark color. All right, that is looking pretty cool. And this star here, I think I want to select the star, and I think I want to scale it up a little bit more because it is just a little bit small. I want to be able to see it better. So I now want to add a background. So I'll go over here to the layout so that we have more space, and I can press Shift A, and I'll go here to Mesh, and I'll add a plane, and I'll scale this plane up so it's pretty big. And then if I go down here, I want to zoom in here to the bottom part, and I'll hit G to grab. I can hit Z to bring it up and down on the Z axis, and I'll just make sure that is about on the bottom there. All right, so now I'll hit the Tab key to go into edit mode, and I'm going to go here to the vertex select, and I'll select the vertex here, hold down the Shift key, select that vertex, and I'll extrude it up on the Z axis and just extrude that up. So now if I go into the camera view, you can see we have a nice background, but I want to select this vertex and shift select this vertex. And I want to add a bevel here so that it is smooth. So I'm going to press Control B to add a bevel, and then I can scroll my mouse wheel out to make more vertices and just place that there. And then I'll go back to object mode, and then I'll use the object context menu to shade the object smooth. So I now want to create a material. So I'll go over here to the shading workspace, and I'll click on new to add a new material, and I can just rename this to background. So I'll zoom out here, go to the principled shader, and for the base color, I want to make this a very bright blue color, but then I'll make it very dark. And the hex value that I'll be using for the dark blue color, if you go to the hex, it's going to be 0B1F33, if you want to use the same value that I'm using. And then also this roughness value here, I'll turn that up to a 0.8 so that it is much more rough. Now I also want to open up the specular value here, and I'm going to take the IOR value and I'm going to turn this down. And you can see if I turn it down, it's going to be even less reflective. So I'm going to turn it down to a value of like 0.05 so that it is much darker. Maybe I could turn this up to like a 0.1, that is okay. So I'll turn it to 0.1. So now we just have this nice dark background. All right, so I'll go back over here to the layout again, and I'm now going to be adding my customizable Christmas lights created with geometry nodes. So if you'd like to go over and watch the tutorial and learn how to create the customizable Christmas lights, I'll have the link to the tutorial in the description, or you can also help support the channel and purchase the finished product files of the customizable Christmas lights. Again, links in the description, and purchasing is a great way to help support this channel. To add in the customizable Christmas lights into this scene, I'm going to click on File, and then I will click on Append. So I'm going to navigate to where I have the product files, and I'm going to go here to Blender files, and I'm going to go here to the geometry node Christmas lights, go inside this Blender file, and then inside the Blender files data, I'm going to go here to the object folder, and I'm going to click and drag just to box select both of these objects here, so the Christmas lights and the light bulb, and then I will click on append. So you can see we've now added it into the scene, and I'm going to bring it over here and I'll just scale it down just to kind of move it out of the way. Now, instead of manually placing them and manually rotating them around the Christmas tree, there is an easier way to do this by using a curve object. So earlier in the video, I went to Blender's preferences, so you can go to edit and go to the preferences. And then over here on the add-ons tab, I searched for extra and I enabled the add curve and add mesh extra objects. So I'm going to be enabling the add curve extra objects add-on. And with that add-on enabled, you can press Shift A and you can go down here to curve, and you can see there's going to be a bunch of curves that you can add. So I'm going to go down here and add the curve spirals, and then I just want to add this top one here. So right after you add this, before you click away or move it around, right behind me there's going to be this little arrow here, which is the curve spiral setting. So right behind me, click on the arrow to open that up, and there's going to be a bunch of different settings that you can play around with to change the curve. So you can turn the number of steps down. So I'm going to turn the number of steps down to just like a 9 so that it is lower poly. And then I can turn the height up, and you can see the height is going to make it rotate around. And then I can also drag the radius around and the radius growth. And so I'm going to turn the radius growth to a very small number. So it starts out very small and then it gets bigger. And I actually need to turn the radius growth to a bigger number. So instead of making it a smaller number, I'm going to make it a bigger number. So I'll turn the radius growth up. So I can now drag the turns. So I'm going to zoom out here so you can see this better. And I'm going to turn the turns up, and you can see it's going to get bigger and bigger. So now to make it so that it gets smaller instead of going up, I can change the height. So I'm going to drag the height down so it goes into a negative value. So by turning that into the negative value, it now goes down. So I'll just drag this down. And then also I want to make the radius smaller because I don't want it to be quite that big. And then this radius growth, I can also turn that down. And then also the amount of turns, I'm going to turn this down a little bit so there aren't quite as many turns. So maybe just turn that to like a 5. All right, so the turns I have at 5, so it's turning around 5 times. Also the steps is the detail. I'm going to set that to 9. And then here's the radius growth. So I have this at about 0.6. And then the radius here, I also have that to about a 0.6. And then the height here, I've turned mine to a negative 1.67. So now it kind of looks like the shape of a Christmas tree. So I can now close these settings, and I can scale the object down, and I can bring it up and scale it down even more. And then I'll go back to object mode. And what I want to do is put the same geometry node setup for the Christmas lights onto this object. So select the object, and you can go here to the modifiers, and I can click on add modifier, and I can add geometry nodes. So we already added the Christmas lights into the scene. So if you click here, you can just choose the Christmas lights. So now that we've added the Christmas lights geometry node setup to the curve, we can scale the curve down in object mode. And I'm going to bring it up, kind of scale it down. And I can go into the camera view and just see how that's looking. I can go to top view, and I just want to move it into the center. So bring it over like that and scale it down even more and kind of bring it up. So already it's done most of the work for us. But if I hit the tab key to go into edit mode, I can select the points here, and I can move the points around just to kind of change that. And what I want to do is click on this button right up here. It's that little circle, and that is going to turn on the proportional editing. So with the proportional editing on, I can hit G to grab. And then I can scroll my mouse wheel, and that is going to pull different vertices around with it. So I'm going to drag these over here, drag this over there, and I'm just going to kind of squish that down so that it fits in the tree. Maybe bring this in a little bit. I can also select everything, and then I can scale everything, and I will hit Shift Z to scale it on the Z-axis and make it a little bit thinner. So just kind of place it around the tree. And to add a little bit of variation, I think I'm going to select some of these points here, and I'll drag them randomly up and down just to add a little bit of variation so that some of them are higher and then other ones are a bit lower. And then I'll go back to object mode, and I also want to show you how you can edit the customizable geometry nodes. So to do that, you can go to the geometry nodes. So I'll just go here to the geometry nodes workspace, and I'll zoom over here to the Christmas lights, and you can see there's many different settings. So there's like the wire subsurf, there's random light placement, so that's kind of like a seed value, there's light rotation, and there's also this wire twist, so you can make the wires twist more. I think I will turn that up a little bit. Then we also have the wire thickness, so I can make the wires thicker if I want to. And then I also have the light bulb scale, so I think I'll turn that up so there's a bit more light bulbs. And there's also the light bulbs amount. So I think I will turn this down to like a 0.01, and that way there's going to be quite a bit more light bulbs. So the light bulbs amount, the lights amount here, this is going to add more lights if it's a smaller number, because it's going to allow less room. So there's basically going to be less room in between each light. And so I can hold down the Z button, move my mouse up into the rendered view, see how that's looking. So now there's many different lights. Now, if you want to change the colors of the light, then what you need to do is navigate over to where you have the single light. So just select that little light right there that we added into the scene, and we can go here to the shading workspace. So go to the shading workspace, and then if you select that light, you can go here to the customizable lights, and you can see there's blue and purple, and there's white and yellow, and many different light colors. I'm going to use the colorful one, so you can plug the colorful into the material output surface. So now if I go back to the original scene by going into the camera view, you can hit the 0 on the numpad to go into the camera view. You can see that there's lots of random colors. So that is really looking quite nice. All right, so we are almost done with the scene. Let's go back here to the layout. One more thing that I want to add though is a depth of field. So let's select the camera, and I can go here to the object data properties. And so this will go to the camera settings, and I'm going to turn on the depth of field here on the bottom, and then I need to choose an object that I want the camera to focus on. So I'm going to click here, and I'm actually just going to choose this cylinder here. So that is going to be the tree trunk. So if I go into the camera view, I can hold down the Z button, go into the rendered view to see how that's looking. So I can first turn the f-stop way down, and you can see it's really blurred. So I can now just click here on the arrow to turn the f-stop up, and I can just see what looks nice. So I probably need to turn it up to at least a 2 or a 3. Right now you can see it's still pretty blurry. And I'm going to turn my f-stop value to a 10 so it's more subtle. So by turning it to a 10, you can see most of it is in focus, but kind of those far branches which are a little bit far away, and also the background is just a little bit blurred. So that's looking pretty nice. All right, so let's go to the render settings. So I'll click here on the render settings, and here on the sampling, I'm going to render it with 100 samples. So press Ctrl S to save your project, and then to render the image, you can press F12, or you can click on render, and you can click on render image. And the render has finished. So let's just finish the scene by doing some compositing. So I'll go over here to the compositing layout. I'll click on use nodes to use the compositing nodes. I can drag this out here, and then because we turned on the Node Wrangler add-on, I can Control Shift and select the render layers to preview it. I'm also going to hold down the Shift key and then right click and drag and let go over those wires, and that is going to add this little reroute here, so it's plugging them both up to the composite and the viewer. So I'll drag these over here, and then also I can press the V key to zoom out the background and Alt V to zoom in the background. So I'm going to drag it out here, drag this back, and let's now add some compositing nodes. So I'm first going to press Shift A, and I'll search for the denoise node to denoise the image and make it look nicer. And I'm going to change that accurate to fast instead. And then I'm also going to press Shift A, and I'm going to search for a glare node because I want to make all the lights glare. And I'll change the streaks to fog glow. And then also the medium here, I'll change to high, so it's a bit higher quality. And we'll just wait for this to load up, and we can see what it's going to look like. Now I also want to add a vignette so that the edges are a bit darker, so that that brings your eyes into the center of the scene. So I'll press Shift A, and I'll go to the search, and I'll search for a box mask. Let's just drop the box mask here, and I can click and drag to make it bigger. And then I can drag the width and height out, and if you have the box mask selected, you should have that white box right there. So I can drag this out to kind of preview the box, and I want the box to be a little bit smaller than the image. So now I want to blur the box, so I'll press Shift A, and I'll go to the search, and I'll search for a blur node, and let's plug the mask up to the image. And then I can Control Shift and select the blur to preview it. Now I want to blur it a lot, so on the X and Y values, I'm going to change these both to 500. So by blurring it, it's going to be white in the center, but you can see the edges are a bit darker. So I just want to add the dark part into the final image. So I'll press Shift A, and I'll go to the search, and I'll search for the alpha over node. Let's drop the alpha over node right here, and then I can plug the blur image up to the factor. And then this glare image, this is going to go into the bottom one. So the blur is going into the factor, and the factor is determining what parts are going to be the top image and what parts are going to be the bottom image. So the top image can now just be fully black. And then I can Control Shift and select the reroute there, and we can preview how it's looking. So the first image is going to be that black vignette, then the bottom image will be that final render there with the glare, and the blur is telling it where those black parts are going to be. So to save the final image, you can select the viewer node, and you can press the N key to open the side panel. And you can click here on node, and then here on node, you can click on save this image. And I'll save this as tree.png. I'll just save it in this folder with my other files, and I will click on save as. And so there is the finished Christmas tree created in Blender with geometry nodes. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and thank you so much for watching. And Christmas of 2023 is almost here as I film this video, so Merry Christmas everyone, and I hope you have a great Christmas day. And if you'd like to purchase the finished project files of this tutorial, you can do that on my Gumroad store and Patreon page. Links are in the description. And you can also check out the Customizable Christmas Lights Geometry Nodes tutorial if you haven't watched that already. And you can also purchase the Customizable Christmas Lights Geometry Node setup. All the links will be in the description. And you can also check out my Blender Christmas tutorial playlist to watch more Christmas themed tutorials. But I hope you enjoyed this, and Merry Christmas.